All right, so we're back for our afternoon session. Here's the rest of our agenda for today. We'll have one presentation from Professor Joel Kaplan from Rutgers. And then one more panel presentation. We'll do some quick administrative updates, hear from Tommy, our legal director. And then Heidi, just so you understand our usual course, is we digest a bit amongst ourselves what we've heard this morning and give direction to staff to come back with refined recommendations. That's the agenda, and then we'll have public comment. Any questions on agenda? Tommy, am I missing anything?
No,
All right.
and part of that, the thing I'll talk about will be update on crime data. So
Yeah,
everyone
the
can look forward
Department
to
of
that.
Justice came out with some crime data, and some other organizations came out with crime data. I'll save it. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to begin this afternoon's session with a short presentation from Professor Joel Kaplan from Rutgers School of Criminal Justice about place-based crime prevention. And then we'll follow up with some Q&A from staff and committee. Professor Kaplan, I think, as you know, the purpose of today's meeting and writ large is to try to identify areas where we can really do our best to improve public safety. And I know that your research looks at that in some maybe anyway, some novel and interesting ways that I think are not the reflective increase punishment and extend sentences. So we're very curious to hear from you. So if you could give us, about 7 minutes, and then we'll reserve the rest for Q&A, I'd really appreciate that.
Happy to. Share screen work. All right.
Looks great.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for giving me the opportunity to share my comments on crime prevention with risk terrain modeling, or RTM.
Did he freeze for everybody else?
For me too, yeah.
Yeah. We're very eager. We're on the edge of our seats. Professor Kaplan, I don't know if you can hear us, but we can't hear you.
RTM diagnoses crime problems and patterns.
Professor Kaplan?
There's a lot of ways in which local data could be. Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you now. You dropped out for about 30 seconds. So you want to just, and I don't know if we can, well, anyway, go for it.
I think we've got a bad connection. Okay.
Right.
He just dropped off. Let's give him a second to rejoin.
New Jersey. Can't resist. The New Yorker in me comes out every time. You cannot resist.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. Well, we'll take that as a good sign. Technical issues, never fail.
It's the end of a Friday where you are, so you get extra grace.
All right. So we'll try this again. Can you see everything all right?
We can.
All right. So I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share my comments on crime prevention with risk terrain modeling, or RTM. RTM diagnoses crime problems, and it does this by connecting environmental features to crime location patterns. There's a lot of ways in which local data can be analyzed with tables and charts for the purpose of crime counts and rates and trends. Local data can also be mapped, and mapping tells valuable information, including the spatial distribution of crime incident locations, whether or not they appear to be random or perhaps clustered or form hotspots. But crime mapping only shows where, not necessarily why they're happening where they are. Risk terrain modeling adds why to the where. Risk terrain modeling analysis performs a spatial diagnosis of the local data. So, for example, we might realize that all of those incidents are located within close proximity to vacant properties or gas stations or convenience stores. And the places where these features co-locate or overlap or intersect with each other can create aggravating risks. These settings can offer unique contexts and opportunities for crime and can be attractive settings for ongoing illegal behavior. Risk trade modeling identifies these risky places, but it also identifies other locations throughout the entire jurisdiction that have similar qualities and therefore can also be vulnerable to crime. This gives us the ability to focus on current problems with information about where to go and what to focus on when we get there, as well as the opportunity for considering the potential for displacement. This gives us the ability to assess relative risks throughout the entire jurisdiction, with a reminder that risks are in fact relative. That is, there could be high-risk places in low-crime neighborhoods and low-risk places in high-crime neighborhoods. This gives us insight about considering how we allocate and distribute services and resources with considerations for spatial equity. Risk train modeling has been studied and applied for a number of different crime types: violent and property crime, everything including gun violence and robberies and assaults, to motor vehicle theft and burglary, retail crime, traffic crashes, and drug overdoses. One of the things we've learned over the years is that different crime problems can have different risk terrains, and different cities can have different risk terrains, even for the same crime problem. That's why diagnosing local crime patterns with risk train modeling allows for tailored solutions and why it can work in California. For example, looking at shootings with risk train modeling, this jurisdiction identified high-risk locations that included convenience stores, vacant buildings, and laundromats within close proximity. This information was shared with the local stakeholders who believed this made sense, because they understood shootings to be connected with turf conflict that was connected with the drug trade. Convenience stores were identified as open late, being easy to loiter, and allowing for the solicitation of drug buyers, who were then sent to the nearby laundromats to make the purchase off the street and out of sight, because the laundromats were also open late, but usually coin operated and not surveilled by a human operator. The buyers would then go to the nearby vacant buildings to use, and the dealers would use the nearby vacant buildings as stash houses for drugs and weapons. This risk narrative that formed from the results of the analysis formed a consensus around the stakeholders involved, and each of them figured out what they can do to address these issues in line with their existing organizational goals and missions. Police focused patrols and did business checks at the high-risk locations. Public Works added streetlights and allocated their improvement program with priority at the particular areas. And the planning department reprioritized the demolitions for vacant properties and the boarding up of vacant properties and maintenance of vacant lots. In another jurisdiction, the city was able to focus on abandoned buildings and vacant lots, particularly those that were city-owned. These happen to be the top two risk factors identified by the analysis. While the city organizations were doing what they could do, they shared this information with other nonprofit partners. These groups use the information for site suitability analysis to remediate abandoned buildings and improve access to affordable housing in line with their organizational mission for doing so. Other groups adopted city-owned vacant lots and turned them into usable, maintained spaces for kids to play, or deployed outreach workers to ensure safe passage for children walking to and from school along high-risk routes. In Kansas City, they codified risk train modeling in a recent legislation that created a multidisciplinary task force to prioritize the delivery of city services. With risk train modeling, this task force was able to readily identify the group or groups that were best suited to address the problems. It's also built on previous work within the city of Kansas City and the police department, focused on using risk train modeling for the purpose of crime prevention with a focus on places and not people. They were able to reduce violent crimes over the course of an entire year of this study without law enforcement actions against people. They were also able to estimate a cost savings of close to $5 million regarding local criminal justice and emergency healthcare system cost savings. And these are similar to outcomes that we've seen elsewhere, with $10 savings for every $1 spent on risk train modeling. In fact, there's a lot of scientific studies and over 75 peer-reviewed journal publications on risk train modeling in the US and around the world. Knowing this, we can think differently about crime prevention. RTM helps to change the conversation about who is responsible for public safety and how they can be involved. And this can be done with confidence, knowing that it's evidence-based, transparent, and effective. Law enforcement is too often a primary response to crime problems. Risk train modeling empowers a diverse group of local stakeholders to do what they do best at the places needing them most. When RTM is applied in this way, it's referred to as data-informed community engagement. It works similar to the way in which a prism breaks up light to form colors of the rainbow. Risk train modeling takes a problem and analyzes it in a way that separates it into its component elements. This allows for multifaceted intervention strategies by multiple stakeholders focused on key places for the purpose of crime prevention and public safety. Within this framework, I'd like you to consider the following points, which I've submitted in my written statement. And with that, I look forward to the conversation and discussion that follows.
Wow. This is the kind of stuff I really gets me excited, which is says something about me, which I'm not sure is awesome. But so at the end of your presentation, I don't mean to interrupt.
Yes, that's it.
Terrific. Assemblymember Brian, I saw your hand was raised for a minute, so let's start there.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. It's funny, I have two kind of initial thoughts hearing this. My first is, I can't possibly like this because how can this not be a proxy for the very people in those places? But then also watching you continue to go through the presentation and thinking about the other ways city departments and services and other
you end your screen share. Sorry, Assemblymember Brian. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, the way that taking care of community landscape can have a positive public safety benefit is also very, very interesting to me. I am curious, you had a pie chart, and I know we just took the screen down, and it had 54%, but then it had a bunch of pictures covering what that 54% was.
Yeah, I can put that back up. Those are actually photos from data-informed community engagement meetings in other cities that have implemented this. One is in Hazel Crest, the middle one is in Newark for the Newark Public Safety Collaborative, and the bottom one is St. Louis. These are just a handful of the recent ones. This pie chart was originally...
Yeah, what are the cuts in this pie chart here? What does this mean?
Right now, it's more abstract than anything else. These breakdowns were one of the original breakdowns of the 40+ members of the Newark Public Safety Collaborative when it first began about 5 years ago. But it's representative of what's intended here, that law enforcement is a small piece or kind of a spoke in the wheel of a larger effort for public safety efforts that involve or empower other stakeholders to be involved in the process.
Got you. And just trying to get a better understanding of what examples, like what does this look like in practice? Because I'm thinking of something that is not exactly the same, but the way we do homeless sweeps, for example, in my city of Los Angeles, sanitation is the lead department and law enforcement is just a spoke in the wheel, but it is very much a criminalization of folks on the street as well, right? So how do we detangle the stigmatization and criminalization of these places? What other departments, what other infrastructures being called in? How does this actually work?
Yeah, so one of the key pieces to using the results of RTM analysis is to invite key stakeholders and community members to be involved in adding context to those results. One example in St. Louis, gas stations next to city-owned vacant lots near schools was a high risk factor for violence. And when that information was brought to the members during this meeting that you see in the photo, they interpreted it in a way that made sense to them. And so, for example, they said, gas stations in this location sell liquor. And so there's liquor, people purchase liquor to go and then go to the nearby vacant properties to use it. Kids after school go and hang out in these areas, and some of them actually are encouraging fight clubs after school in some areas, and they go to some of these isolated sections and use these facilities for that purpose. And understanding or vetting the results of the information and connecting it with lived experiences and multiple perspectives forms kind of a storyline that everybody can understand. And then the response is to disrupt that narrative. That is not to go to these areas and assume everybody located there is a potential suspect, but make the places less conducive for the types of behaviors that you're trying to prevent. And in this case, the nuisance abatement team by the city prioritized vacant lot remediation and demolition. The local churches instituted family game nights after schools, after school hours and in the evening hours, and they reutilized these spaces in a way that made for positive engagement in the areas.
Right. Again, can I ask you to it's just distracted to me can you get us off of shared screen?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. So according to some of the things I've read, some policies, it's in some ways, I think it's aiming to address some of the member Brian's questions about how do we actually implement this? Is that planning departments will see this X number of liquor stores in a particular neighborhood and will just limit them. Just say like, we're not going to have this many in this square jurisdiction. And that has been an effective way of reducing street crime. Is that an oversimplification?
It is somewhat of an oversimplification, because getting rid of convenience stores or gas stations can have a lot of ripple effects and implications. Some of these areas could be food deserts, and some of these convenience stores could be the only location where people get fresh produce and food. So it's not just about saying that you can get rid of the problem, but rather risk train modeling identifies these features and says not all convenience stores are risky, but convenience stores next to gas stations near highway on-ramps are riskier. Why is that the case? And then the interventions address that opportunity that's presented there. And it allows for identifying potential partners in the solution. We're not saying that convenience stores cause crime, but rather they could be equally victimized, and so could their patrons at the same time. And working with them to find ways to increase security or mitigate risk is something that we see in a lot of cities using RTM.
Perhaps convenience stores is a difficult first place to start, especially small business owners, and that adds to the complications. But vacant lots, that seems a little bit less politically sensitive. And my understanding is that there's excellent evidence showing just cleaning up vacant lots and turning them into public spaces and adding lighting, that those types of with seemingly less controversial interventions do have impact. Is that accurate?
That's right. And some cities have 5, 10, 15,000 vacant properties, 8,000 of which are city owned. And sometimes it becomes an overwhelming task to address these. And you don't just want to throw a dart against the wall and see what sticks, but rather, how do you focus on the first 25 vacant lots that will have the biggest impact on crime? Well, if you focused on the vacant lots near the gas stations next to the schools, given your understanding of the nature of that crime problem, you might address violent crime. If you focus on vacant buildings that are privately and publicly owned near, might do something about motor vehicle theft or some other type of crime problem or issue like drug overdoses.
I get it. So that there are specific combinations of geographic feature, urban feature, I don't know, whatever you want, that actually you can really pinpoint the specific types of criminal activity that you are trying to abate.
Exactly. Yeah, it's optimizing existing resources. And when multiple agencies do that, you're focusing on place management for the purpose of crime prevention. And RTM helps you kind of reverse engineer the patterns based upon offender preferences and trying to understand how people interact with these spaces to reduce risk.
Okay, I'm curious about how you think governments, so one obvious way that governments can intervene here is by sending more police, as you had mentioned, to the specific convenience store, laundromat, or whatever it happens to be. I suppose another would be to be cleaning up the vacant lots, especially the government-owned vacant lots. I had suggested more of the planning licensing of, it seems a little bit more, maybe more aggressive. Are there other ways that governments can and should intervene here?
Yeah, in fact, evidence would suggest that all of them can do a small part at the same places to address elements that they have some control or influence over. And so while the planning department is taking care of vacant properties, Weights and Measures might prioritize their inspections of gas stations. The city ordinance inspector might prioritize business checks in some of these areas. The fire marshal might do the same. Police can do directed patrols, like you mentioned, but they don't need to assume everybody located there is a suspect, but rather do business checks and engage in that way. And community groups can be involved as well. I mentioned the places of worship with family game night, and it can involve multiple stakeholders in that process.
Now, it seems like, and I'm monopolizing the conversation, so Heidi, Isaac, Peter, jump in, please. Seems like if you were, this would be really helpful to somebody who's like mayor, who like had, responsibility and control over planning departments and police departments and sanitation or whatever it happens to be. We advise the state legislature, a large state for a large state, which are there examples, first of all, of states that have tried to find legislation to take advantage of some of these findings? Or do you have a magic wand suggestion if you were in the California state legislature or the New Jersey state legislature, whatever it happened to be, of ways to, and I'm going to limit you by saying, add money to create a program to study it doesn't count.
I'm not aware of any legislation at the state level. I am aware of some municipalities that have done this recently. I mentioned Kansas City, and the city of Dallas created an office under the mayor's office called the Office of Integrated Public Safety Solutions, which oversees all of these city services and uses risk train modeling to allocate those resources separate from the police.
And do we have results? Do we know whether that has been particularly effective or not?
Evidence suggests it's effective. I don't know of any published research studies on it, but there's a lot of written information about it. The use of risk train modeling is actually done in partnership with a nonprofit organization who shares information with the city during their DICE meetings.
Are you aware of any programs that are going on in California?
There are at least 2 agencies that are or have begun using risk train modeling, but only recently.
And can you tell us what they are?
One of them is, well, actually, one of them I don't know if they've made themselves public yet, so I won't make it my job to do that for them. But the other one is part of a fellowship program with the 30 by 30 initiative. And that is that officer is in San Francisco.
And I assume that you see this as something very distinct from, hey, police officers look at a map and they see there's a bunch of robberies and, on the corner of, X and Y, and so we're going to send some more police there. Seems like you're suggesting that this is something quite different than that.
Very different. And even when police are involved, it gives them information about what to focus on beyond the people located there at any given moment in time. That's key.
Right. It's one thing, and then we're kind of running at the end of the time. There's something that you'd mentioned. I wrote it down. I tried to get it, the quote, but I missed it. It's like you said, we're intervening on places or not people. Oh, reduce crime without impacting people. So you said something to that effect?
Focus on places, not people, to prevent crime might be something. Yes. The risk train model.
So modify the place
Right. Right. Understanding how certain places attract certain behaviors over and over and over again allows us to get at the underlying conditions that facilitate chronic and persistent crime issues. And so we hear you can't arrest your way out of the crime problem. That's true. You also can't police your way out of the crime problem. That's also true. What you need are multiple resources to address complex issues. And one of those things can be to focus on the places that attract and enable illegal activity.
And when you say place, you mean like gas station and specific corners, not neighborhoods or whatever.
Well, yeah, so I guess I use place in a number of different ways, but yes, those are place features, and those features can be located in close proximity to one another to create settings that are conducive to certain types of behavior and ongoing activities. So when I talk about places, I'm talking about these kind of micro settings.
So it's not gas stations, it's not laundromats, it's when they're together or whatever. Sorry, Assemblymember Bryan.
No, I'm just trying to wrap my head around this because I'm not sure if I like it yet, Professor, but I'm trying to keep an open mind. You mentioned that there are high I guess what was the low crime areas with places as well. What would an example like that look like? Because if you were asking kind of somebody who's not using this deep of a data informed analysis they would say, yeah, it's the places that are have the underfunded schools that don't bring in the same kind of property taxes as other places. It's where the proliferation of liquor stores are. It's a distance to the nearest grocery store. It's the absence of the kind of institutions that build thriving communities that would be kind of the crime hotspots as I sit on the corner of Crenshaw and Slauson right now for my LA folks. And so I'm just wondering, what does a low crime area hotspot, what are the features of that kind of a location? What have been some examples of what that looks like in places where this has been implemented?
Well, it could appear differently in different jurisdictions, but some of the things that you've described are kind of citywide or regional areas. I teach at Rutgers in the city of Newark. Everybody says Newark is a bad city. But when I go into Newark, I know that there are really nice areas and there are places that feel safer to me at the micro level than otherwise would be understood at the citywide level. And the same is true in low crime areas. Even in a low crime area, there could be higher risk places. It doesn't mean that there's going to be crime. It doesn't guarantee that crime is going to happen. But crime risk is relative, and it's relative at the micro level within larger areas. It's not fair to just define a city as bad or dangerous, but rather to understand that there are low risk areas that we can capitalize on and learn from and bring into other parts of the city. And the same thing is true in low crime areas. We can identify high risk places and mitigate those risks to prevent crime from emerging or persisting.
And to answer and to Assemblymember Bryan's question or a little bit more, I think that what you're saying, Professor, is that you're talking on a much more specific level than neighborhoods, and even much more specific than vacant lots per se, or gas stations per se. It is the sort of close proximity of these things which might increase the likelihood of and indeed you could say specific types of crimes. That like
Exactly.
violent crimes might be the combination of a vacant lot next to a laundromat next to a thing within 100 yards of each other. Whereas bicycle thieves, might be some other constellation of features.
That's right. When you diagnose motor vehicle theft patterns, you realize that it has to do with pharmacies and liquor stores and restaurants in the city of Newark. We asked the locals why, and restaurants are delivery drivers picking up food and leaving their cars running. Pharmacies are people running in to get their prescription quickly on their way to work. Liquor stores are, people running in to get something to drink on their way home from work. So people interact with different spaces at different times and at different days of the week and different times and days of the year. And risk terrains can vary. They're very dynamic throughout a jurisdiction, and they are specific to crime types and they are specific to times as well.
Are there and then I'll leave it. I've read or seen studies about things that seem, like I said, perhaps less controversial, just like street lighting. Is that also part of the terrain analysis?
It can. In fact, in the city of Atlantic City, they had several thousand streetlights that they had to switch out from halogen to LED. And everybody was asking for that to be done in their jurisdiction, but they justified where to do it by prioritizing the areas that were high risk. Gave them the ability to say no to some of the most vocal constituents and explain why, and to explain why they were going into some of the other areas with priority.
And is it, and by doing the improvements in the lighting that did have an impact on criminal activity?
Lighting has been shown in the research to improve crime, yes, or reduce risk.
I mean, it seems obvious, but anyway, it's good to hear.
Yeah,
I find these interventions very interesting. I obviously see the hazards. So remember, Ryan, that you've raised, and it sort of concentrates once again, everybody's attention in these bad neighborhoods. But I do think that there are ways that we can address, and we should, as a state and communities, crime without just arresting people all the friggin' time. And I don't want to obviously deprive people of, groceries, but maybe if we could spread them out, or not put them next to vacant lots, or just clean up the vacant lots, or employ people who are underemployed to clean up vacant lots, or put up more streetlights. And if that will save people's lives and property and improve public safety, those are the types of things that I think that we should be, a lot more heavily invested in, rather than sentencing enhancements.
Oh yeah, and Professor, I mean, when I was preparing for this section, I immediately went to the darkest predictive policing spaces that I've ever, been in terms of skepticism. But you've done a hell of a presentation and given me a lot to think about. I'm looking forward to diving deeper into this literature.
thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everyone.
All right. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
We keep rolling.
Yeah, let's keep
All
rolling.
right. Here comes Anita and Stephen Jesse from the Alameda County DA's office.
Hello. Hi, Anita. We're waiting for Stephen. Hi. You are, last but not least, our panel for today. We've been really trying to think about the penal code and justice system and criminal law in a way that isn't about just locking people up, meaning, how do we help victims? How do we help communities? How do we, that are beyond sentence enhancements, to pick something. It was a conversation not that long ago that I had with some folks, the DA's office in Philadelphia, about asset forfeiture, that really got me thinking about ways that police and law enforcement intervene in ways that might be to think differently about it in a way that may be helpful to our communities. So anyway, that's what we're going to talk about for the next 30 minutes or so, and I really appreciate your time. As I've said before, I'm going to ask you each to give a short 5-minute presentation, no longer than 5 minutes, because really the most important part of our conversation is the conversation part. So thank you for joining us. Anita Lee is the Principal Fiscal and Policy Analyst for the Legislative Analyst Office. Or do you have a specific department?
I cover judiciary, DOJ, gambling issues, so it's a pretty broad portfolio.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. And Stephen Jesse Corral.
It's corral, like the old horse corral.
Corral, excuse my pronunciation, who's the Deputy District Attorney for the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. Sorry that Senator Skinner, your senator, couldn't be joining us today, but
I see her on there though.
oh, she's lurking. But be careful what you say. Anyway, no, just kidding. Miss Lee, would you kick us off?
Sure. I am going to share my screen. So just hopefully you can see that.
Yep. 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Anita Lee with the Legislative Analyst Office. We've provided a copy of this handout. It's also available on our website. We're going to be using it as a guide for our comments today, but we are not, rest assured, we're not going to cover all of the details. We're keeping that time frame in mind. So to preface our comments, committee staff asked that we provide some information and data specifically related to the state asset forfeiture process in recent years to help the committee with its discussions. And so when we heard from the committee, we were able to update some of the data, but for the most part, a lot of what we're going to be talking about today comes from a statutorily required report that we completed in 2020. And so one of the key things that we would just flag for you is that in that 2020 report, we identified a number of challenges with the various data sources that we were using, including that the data was incomplete and limited, which is really going to impact the comprehensiveness and the accuracy of the data that we're going to be presenting to you today. So this committee, we understand in listening to prior comments, has reviewed materials. So we're actually going to skip over, some background on asset forfeiture. One of the things that we would flag just quickly for the committee is our understanding of the most recent significant changes that were made to the state's asset forfeiture processes actually occurred in January of 2017 when Senate Bill 443 became effective. And just at a very high level, it increased the requirements or the burden of proof that the government needed to meet in order to keep assets that had been seized. So moving directly sort of into the data, for those who might be listening in, this is going to be page 5 of your handout. Between 2011 and 2018, California generally received more than 100 million annually from both federal and state asset forfeiture distributions. There was a dip between 2019 and 2022, but then it seemingly bounced back in 2023. If you look at the table before you, the dark bar, the dark blue, reflects state asset forfeiture proceeds. And you can see that it generally represents less than 40% of total proceeds. Since 2011, more than 500 prosecutorial and law enforcement agencies in California have received at least one distribution from state asset forfeiture dollars. Turning to the next page, since 2014, the number of state asset forfeiture cases that have been initiated appear to be declining, which you can see on this figure before you. And it's a decline of 60%, specifically from 3,460 cases in 2014 to 1,409 cases in 2023. Moving then to the next page, this is now page 7. The figure before you shows the value of assets seized and the amount distributed in state asset forfeiture cases. You can see that for both of these lines on this graph, they generally increase until about 2016, and then they start fluctuating. The topmost line shows the value of assets seized. There was a spike in 2020. But if we look at 2023, the 41.5 million seized in 2023 is 16% lower than the amount seized in 2016. Shifting to the bottom line, the dark line, that shows total distributions. And so looking to 2023, the 41.3 million that was distributed is a 9% increase from the amount that was distributed in 2016. Moving to page 8 of your handout, one of the major beneficiaries of these types of resources are law enforcement. And so if you look at the figure before you, between 2011 and 2018, police departments generally receive the largest share of state asset forfeiture dollars. There was a decline in the share going to sheriff's offices and police departments beginning in 2015 and 2016. And this contrasts with the increase in the share going to task forces, to the point where task forces were actually receiving the most in distributions beginning in 2017. And that's the green line on this figure before you. But to kind of put that into context, when we looked in detail at total asset forfeiture distributions, both federal and state, in 2018, the amounts that they were receiving generally made up less than 1% of the budget for 89% of the California law enforcement and prosecutorial agencies that were receiving distributions. We would note, however, that asset forfeiture proceeds can make up a more sizable portion of task force budgets, but there wasn't data that was readily sort of available for us to fully assess that.
Right. You're at your time.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I mean, let's see, we can wrap up real quick.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so the last page of your handout, the committee was interested in Health and Safety Code 11489, which was related to drug-related asset forfeitures and where the money goes. And so 24% of that is deposited into the state general fund. What that translates to is less than $12 million annually. The amount, 11.9 million deposited in 2023, is about a 29% increase over the amount deposited in 2016-17. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you very much. Like I said, I think we'll have tons of questions for you once we hear from Stephen. Stephen, take it away, please.
Thank you. And I thank you for inviting me, and I commend all the hard work you've been doing. I know it's exhausting, but I really commend on you, especially on some of these proposals. I'm going to limit my comments on some of the proposals that you have before you. And I just want to tell you up front, I do not represent Alameda County District Attorney's Office. I'm here as the co-chair for the California District Attorneys Association, which
my apologies. I got you.
Okay, that's quite all right. I just want to be clear, and I'm actually at lunchtime too. I'll let you know that as well. And I also had an opportunity to talk with several other deputy DAs around the state. Once I got the proposals, to kind of get an earful on some of the opinions they may have on some of the proposals you have here coming forward. And I will say that on all the three proposals, for the general sense, was favorable. I'll first look at the funding for crime victims, and we're talking about the section 11489 and the subsections, which is the 15% of the 65%. And right now, it's limited to just to combat drug abuse and divert gang activity. We're all 100% in support of expanding that definition to include victims of crimes. And the reason why I say that is that I'm aware of programs in urban counties for human trafficking victims. And they're really excellent programs that are out there that are helping to get transition them out of that lifestyle into something that's much better and more promising. And so to expand the definition of what kind of programs should be allowed is you got 100%, at least the people I spoke with are favorable to that. Where the problem might be is how you function it and how it shall work. But I'll wait on that, making a comment on that. On the second proposal, PC 186-2, what we call Little Rico of California. I'm probably one of the few deputy DAs around the state that actually has extensive experience in this area of law. And I will say, anytime you want to expand the definition, I am totally in favor of doing that. RICO, which is federal, has hundreds of statutes. California has 34, which is not too great. So if we want to expand it to include criminal activity for including retail theft, we already have 496, possession of stolen property. We already have 487, grand theft. Adding 490.4, the retail theft, would be a great idea. And I will tell you that I get calls from all over the state about task force that have been developed to go after retail theft, these crime rings, and they're finding accounts full of money and they're finding cash, but there's nothing they can do about it. Where this provision here will allow law enforcement to go after their proceeds, taking away the incentive. of these crime rings. We also talked about the illegal sale of firearms. This is a problem that's been raised to me as well over the years that I've been involved in asset forfeiture, where you have gun runners. More lately is ghost gun producers and manufacturers. We've got to have a mechanism to go after the cash that their proceeds they're making from this activity. But what has to be noted is under Penal Code Section 186.2 subsection D is what they define as organized crime. And so if we're going to add on new sections, you'll see in subsection D, there's a description of various different types of crimes. And adding on organized retail theft, illegal retail of firearms and weapons would be great to add into that section as well if some legislation is being proposed sometime in the future. My last comments is on proposal 3. This one comes a little more controversial in some of the feedback I'm getting, to add a minimum. As you're aware, and you've pointed out, there is no minimum. But I will tell you, practically speaking, there is a minimum because it's a policy decision. Every county has their own decision of what a minimum is. And the reason why they have that is because of practicalities. Do we want to spend a lot of money on a guy who had $50? The answer is no. And so every county has a different minimum. And I will tell you what I've noticed is the bigger urban counties, LA, San Diego, have an amount of a minimum of 1,500. The more suburban counties have a minimum of about 1,000. The rural counties have a minimum of about 500. And that's kind of how it all goes across. But no one seems to be opposed to having a minimum, but where you set it is viable and important, especially when you look and consider some counties don't have as big cases and would like to see some problematic issues resolved by disincentivizing the asset forfeiture aspect of that.
Really interesting to me. Couple of questions. I'm going to start with Ms. Lee. Let me make sure I want to make sure that I understood the data, the information properly. First, you said there's about $100 million a year in asset forfeiture in California statewide. Is that right?
That's combined. It includes both federal and state.
And when you say federal, that's the feds taking the money, taking assets and then giving it to California? Or what?
Yeah. So asset forfeiture can happen at the federal and the state level. And so there are different processes that can happen.
Wait, I'm surprised. That seems like a lower number than I would have guessed. Is California an outlier in one way or another on that?
Our mandate under statute was to examine the changes that were made by SB 443. And so we've definitely focused on just California. And so it's a little, I think that's an interesting question. That's certainly not something that we looked at, unfortunately.
And you don't know off the top of your head. All right. And another thing that you said is that $100 million, which I don't want to sneeze at $100 million, but is less than 1% of law enforcement spending. Is that something that you had said something to that effect?
So
that would make sense.
Yeah, so that is specific. I want to be very clear. That's specific to the data in 2018. And so one of the things, remember, I mentioned is that we've got data issues. But in 2018, when we looked at that, the distributions in that year, it was less than 1% of the budget for 89% of law enforcement and prosecutorial agencies that received money in that year. And the only reason why I emphasize that is when we looked at kind of the data from, over 2011 through 2018, it did fluctuate a little bit. You were seeing kind of similar patterns, but it did fluctuate.
Listen, I appreciate LAO has always been super precise and accurate, and I totally appreciate that. But I'm going to assume for the purposes of our conversation that it's not dramatically different 5 years later. Okay.
Yeah.
And Mike, just sorry to jump in, but I think to that end, somewhere in the penal code or wherever it says, and law enforcement shouldn't basically count on this money to be there every year. So it's kind of written into law what you're getting at. Correct. And what the data is showing.
I am aware of that. What's a task force?
So a task force can take up different constructions, but generally it is where multiple cities, counties, sometimes the state and federal governments are involved, where multiple law enforcement agencies are working together, usually for a dedicated purpose. It can be, specifically related to drug crimes. It can specifically be related to firearms. In California, for example, we have task forces that are kind of more major crime kind of focused. And so usually they are created for particular purposes, and there are very specific agreements amongst all of the parties related to jurisdiction, how things are going to proceed if there is some sort of enforcement action, including related to asset forfeitures. And so for on the asset forfeiture side, they sometimes actually include specific requirements in terms of how the money is going to be distributed amongst all of the partners.
And they've been hoovering, they've been taking up a larger share of the asset forfeiture money, looks like.
In the more recent times when, when we last did the data, that was one of the figures that we were not able to update since 2018. So we don't know kind of currently how that looks.
And the last question I have, again, this is just understanding, when the burden of proof changed, I forget the bill number,
SB 443.
it looked like it was a dramatic reduction in the number of cases that there was asset forfeiture. But the dollar number seemed relatively consistent. Am I reading the data correctly?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we highlighted in our report was that we thought that behavior was still adjusting. So as part of our work, we had conversations with different practitioners. And so we thought that behavior was adjusting in response
When you
to
say behavior adjusting, whose behavior?
law enforcement, as well as prosecutorial agencies, and adjusting to what cases were taken on, the threshold. There were other changes that were actually happening in the federal process as well. So that interacted with basically decisions in California in terms of whether your asset forfeiture case would be pursued at the state level, at the federal level, either related to the seizure or the adjudication, et cetera. So a really kind of good example of kind of thinking about changing the burden of proof threshold for a certain dollar value is that sometimes, if above that threshold, that requirement is not there, one of the arguments related to that is it focuses your law enforcement prosecutorial efforts on those bigger cases where those dollar values are kind of more at issue and at stake. And so that kind of goes to what your question related to the data in terms of number of cases initiated versus, value of items seized, and then kind of the total distribution down the line as well.
So just to piggyback on the chair and that response, does that mean prior to the burden shifting, there was kind of maybe a wider net cast and not this more intentional targeting of higher asset investigations?
It's certainly possible. And I think the key thing is when we were doing our work, one of the things that we noticed was all of these changes that were happening both at the state level. So think about our propositions as well. So propositions 47, et cetera, had changes on behaviors, but there were also changes happening at the federal level. And that made it really difficult for us to parse out and isolate the specific changes that were directly attributable to SB 443 and kind of similar changes in the past. And so the best that we could do was kind of based on conversations that we had, we did have conversations with stakeholders, kind of posit what could be leading to those changes that you're receiving. And so one of the things that you're saying, that is one of the behavioral actions in terms of previously broader net may have been cast. With these changes, it's the adjustment of a behavior, potentially focusing on bigger ticket, bigger dollar values, et cetera.
And the main reason I asked that is to Mr. Corral's point. Minimums seem to vary regionally, and I'd be curious not what the average is, but what the median amount is in this new era of shifted behavior change, because it would suggest to me then that the places where the minimum is lower than other places might still be casting this wider net without perhaps the financial benefit of that work if you were doing a more targeted approach at the more high value investigations. It seems like your financial incentive could be the same, or at least that's what the data is suggesting. Is that a fair read of that?
Is that a question for me or Anita?
Both.
I just think that what happens in the rural counties who have the lower threshold, that we don't see a whole lot of resources going toward narcotic investigations. And so we don't see a larger amount, or we see smaller amounts coming out from them. And they don't have as many task force. They're not as involved with the feds as, say, the suburban and urban counties are. And so I think if you raise the minimum too high, it would be difficult on them, and they would feel like they would be left out on being able to participate in asset forfeiture. But we all think that a minimum would be a great idea.
And Mr. Corral, could you just why should we be able to take somebody's, I know we're not locking them up, but we're taking their property on less than proof beyond a reasonable doubt, right?
So you're talking, you have to differentiate. There's the administrative forfeitures, and then there's the petitions for forfeiture, which are over 40 grand. So it really it depends on what type of case it is. If someone is opposed to the forfeiture, will file a claim that under 40 grand that requires us proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So a lot of it can depend on the reaction to the person who the property was taken from. And of course, as we've talked about, and we're all aware, that this is basically to take away the incentive of the profit from being involved in drug activity. And we've seen case after case where they would lose the asset forfeit aspect of their case. They get placed on probation, and then at some point they decide, I'm not going to go to work for the local police department because they're going to get all my money. So they go on to something else to get involved in some other kind of activity, a little more positive related.
All right, so just to make sure, and maybe somebody can jump in to explain, for under $40,000, if the petitioner objects, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime was committed and that the asset was related to the crime. Is that the deal?
Yeah, and they're also required to have a conviction.
Over $40,000, that does not.
No, and that's because there's a presumption that if it's over 40,000, you're more of a trafficker. And so we don't want to place as much of a burden on a trafficker who runs around with bundles of cash, as opposed to the guy in the corner who's trying to make a little extra dollar for himself or his family. So there's equity concerns, that are built into the statute as well.
And let me know if I have this wrong, but I think those higher rules apply if, as you're saying, someone objects to the forfeiture. But if they don't, the rules are easier to do forfeiture. And I guess the question is, how often do people object, and sort of some of the reasons people may or may not do that.
So I could say that the way it's done here is that we don't serve them with an asset forfeiture case until they get an attorney.
Okay.
We do that in court. Others may do it out in the field at the time of arrest, but we do it once they have an attorney, so that an attorney can fully explain to them, whether or not they're going to file a claim or not. And some decide not to. They don't feel they need to. They go on to some kind of diversion program and feel that amount is something they'll give up on, and so they don't file. But they have an opportunity, and we are very keen, and if we feel it's extremely important that their due process rights are heard and they're served. So they make a good rational decision.
Right, but if they don't file, the burden of proof is different. I just want to make sure I have that right, and that just sort of I think it depends on the money value again, and we tried to not get lost in these weeds in our presentation to the committee. So it's if it starts to get very technical, but I think that's the key thing. If you don't object, then the stuff about beyond a reasonable doubt and a conviction is not required. And I think the question, we weren't able to find any data on this. I'm just curious what you all think. How often do people object? Because if we're talking about, and I'm just pulling this out of thin air, people object 5% of the time, then we're not really dealing with beyond a reasonable doubt as a burden. It's whatever it is when you don't object. But maybe people object 80% of the time. I don't know. But I think it's just important to keep sort of the two different systems in mind as we talk about it a little bit.
Okay. So first I want to point out is that there are large amounts of cases, and I don't know how we would be able to dig this up, that never get filed.
Right.
It doesn't become the police don't want to get involved, and they don't want to serve anybody. They want to give the money back if the guy makes a motion to return property. So there's a number of those. Those, when we decide, we get the cases from the police departments, we make a decision, and our county will make a decision that the case is charged. Others can go forward without a case being charged. And once it's charged, it will get them served. Now, if they don't file, and they've made a conscious decision that we've got a record that they've got all their rights known, and they decide they're not going to, then we file a default judgment. So we basically inform the court that their due process rights were covered. They didn't file, they defaulted. There's a time period that they need to file their claim. That wasn't done. And based upon that, we're asking this amount now be forfeited. So we ask for an order to do that.
Right.
A court order to do that, right.
All right. Heidi, Peter, do you have Senator Skinner? All right. This is really interesting. I learned a bunch here. I'm surprised to hear some of this, but I really appreciate it and the data. Yeah.
One last question. This was to follow up when we talked about expanding Little Rico. Steve, you said right now, like an organized retail theft task force might find like a couch full of cash or whatever. And so what happens now to that money if you can't forfeit it under current law? Does it just sort of, I don't know, what it's a mystery.
So I mean, right now, it'd probably convincingly be evidence that they were involved in retail theft. So it would stay as evidence. But once the case has been adjudicated, they can make a motion to return property and get their cash back.
Okay.
And it is a problem because I tell you that because I get emails and phone calls throughout the state from these retail theft task force that have been focusing on these rings, and they're frustrated. So expanding 186 Little Rico could perhaps be an answer to them.
Thank you. That was it, Mike. Thank you. Sorry about that.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Anita. Really appreciate your time. As I say, usually no good deed goes unpunished. I'm sure we'll be back in touch. Likewise, please be in touch with us if there are ideas that you think that we might be most helpful with.
We'll do that. Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good weekend.
You too.
All right. Coming to the third act of the show. Now that we heard from our witnesses, we have a few other matters to go over before a discussion of next steps. We'll begin with the minutes from our March 2024 meeting. Will someone please, I'm going to move to adopt the minutes. Will somebody please second?
I wasn't at that meeting, so I think maybe someone else who is in attendance should second.
All right. Judge Espinoza, are you seconding?
Yes.
All in favor of adopting the minutes?
Aye.
No objection. Next, Tom Nosowitz will provide a brief legislative update and crime data for 2023 and 2024. Tom, take it away.
Okay. I assume everyone can hear me and see the screen, so let's get going. Okay, a legislative update very quickly. This has an error on it, and it has to do with Assemblymember Bryan's bill, so I apologize for that. The first bill is no longer exist. It should be AB 2215 with Assemblymember Bryan on law enforcement being able to take people not to jail but to other services. Then we have a post-conviction bill of Mr. Ting something in the transportation omnibus, and Senator Minjavar has a great competency to stand trial bill. These are all either on the floor or waiting to get through appropriates at this point. And I apologize for that.
What's 2483? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is what our nickname for it, and it's a nerdy nickname, of course, is the Code of Post-Conviction Procedure. So this creates a set of default rules that applies in every resentencing, every time you go back to court, a long time after your conviction is finished. And what it did, the recommendation from the committee pulled together what courts had said, what had been in bills, and what practitioners told us. It was just never all been in one place. So there's sometimes people are fighting over collateral procedural things instead of getting to the merits of whether something should be resentenced. So this would create those procedures, and also creates a clear process to get records from CDCR for resentencing, which we've been working very closely with them to make sure that works for them, and would hopefully actually save them some money down the line to have a clear process in place for that.
Perfect. There was a California Supreme Court decision this week, maybe, that was about post-conviction resentencing procedure, and anyway.
It was about felony murder, and whether, if we're thinking of the same one.
No, I don't think it's felony murder, but maybe. Go ahead.
I think you're wrong then. Okay, we will figure it out. Let's talk about crime data. Okay, so first we're going to look at 2023 crime data, which came out about 2 weeks ago from the California Department of Justice. So this is statewide. This is the official numbers for California. And the top line results, or the violent crime rate increased 3.3% compared to 2022. Property crime rate decreased 1.8%. So this is what that looks like over time. So this is going back to 1969. The blue line is the property crime rate. So as we can see, we are at an extremely low rate. And in fact, we're at the lowest property crime rate since before the pandemic. So it's, if you sort of take out the pandemic years, our property crime rate is the lowest it has ever been since at least 1969. And the violent rate is a little bit higher. Here's the violent rate. It gets a little obscured when we look at property crime, so we separate that out. And again, violent crime is elevated from where it has been in the years before the pandemic, but it's still significantly lower than the high. Now, and then these are the specific offenses that are tracked, the differences. So a big drop in homicide, 16%, about a 5% drop in rape, 3% increase in robbery, and a 5% increase in aggravated assault. That's all the violent crimes. And burglary, we see, in the property crimes, I should say, 8% drop in burglary, 8% rise in car theft, overall 3% drop in larceny theft, which I'll get into a little bit more, and a big drop in arson as well. Now, all that being said, those are the numbers that the Department of Justice reports. Unfortunately, this year, there were a larger than number usual of agencies, including some big ones that didn't report full data, including the San Jose Police Department and San Bernardino Sheriff. So those places were in 2022 data. They're not in the 2023 data. So given that some of the changes in the crimes are so small, it's likely that if we were to have full data for 2023, we might see some differences there. So all that is to say, the bigger the drop was, the more confident we can say there was a drop. The smaller the change was, the less confidence we can have in it. So that's overall. And there's also some special complications from Oakland this year. It looks like Oakland's way overreported their aggravated assaults in 2023. They reported a 236% increase, obviously quite huge. It looks like it might only be a 10% increase, and this is based on reporting that was in the San Francisco Chronicle earlier this week. And Oakland generally was an outlier. So what I did is I took them away from the data. If we just take the city of Oakland out, one city with about 400,000 people in it, the violent crime rate before it increased a little bit, it actually would have dropped by 1.37%, and that property crime rate
it's
decreased.
300, and it's close to 400,000, but that's okay.
I thought that's what I said. What did I'm sorry, Sarah. That's what I had in my head.
You're saying if you take Oakland out, statewide violent crime rate drops 1.3%, 1.4%.
It goes from a slight increase to a slight decrease, and the property crime rate, goes up another few percentage points as well. So, and I think that's particularly fair to do with the violent crime because we have this issue with the aggravated assaults that is way over the top. But those are the caveats on the data. I just thought this year it's worth pointing those out because they were worse than they were in other years. So a little bit more about
how sad this data is making me right now, thinking about what's on this November ballot. and how
Well,
stupid we are.
I'm gonna make you even more depressed, unfortunately, before we get to the end. It's a very mixed bag. There's some good news and some bad news, especially on the things related to the new Prop 36.
Okay.
So violent crime. So we're gonna just talk about how we are doing now compared to 23 compared to the before the pandemic. So violent crime overall is up 18% compared to where it was in 2019. But the homicide rate, which is a subset of violent crime, is very close to its pre-pandemic level. And in 2019, we had the lowest homicide rate we had ever had in California. So we can look at that a little bit. So, here's 2019, pandemic, homicide goes up a lot. This happened across the country and it starts to go down. And we're almost back to where we were in 2019. We're closer to where we were before the pandemic than where we were last year. And as I said, that pandemic rate was the lowest it had ever been. So it's, we're at a very near to a record low homicide rate. Let's do a similar analysis with property crime. So property crime went down a lot in the early years of the pandemic because people were at home. Makes sense. We've now, and then it started to go up during the pandemic and went down this year. So a bit of a seesaw. But if we look at 2019 compared to 2023, we're a little bit lower, less than a percentage point lower now than in 2019. And the 2019 property crime rate was the lowest property crime rate we had in our recorded crime data. So we're at a very good place overall property crime. The 2023 burglary rate was the lowest burglary rate we have in the data. And the theft rate was the lowest we had in the data, except for the first 2 years of the pandemic. And the arson rate is the lowest since 1980 was when we started to track it. So within property crime, we have some very good trends happening, and violent crime overall is up, but that homicide rate is very good. Okay, so this is where I don't mean to ruin your Friday afternoon, Mr. Bryan, but this is where it might start to happen. So within thefts, we can look at specific theft crimes, including shoplifting and theft of parts from cars, like catalytic converters. So here's the shoplifting rate. 2023, the overall shoplifting rate went up about 40% from where it was in 2022. Which, on one hand is to be expected because it went down a lot during the pandemic. So we were kind of returning to pre-pandemic levels, but we're much higher than we were before the pandemic with the shoplifting rate. And this is what this looks like on a monthly basis. So these bars here are annual rates, just year to year to year. This is monthly data, so we can look at monthly reports, and we can see what happened is, this is the pandemic, this big drop here, went down. The reports started to recover, go up as things reopened to some degree. But then we see for all of 2022 and 2023, there was more shoplifting reported month after month after month. So this trend is increasing, and it was at its highest at the end of 2023. So,
Tom, have you seen data? I forget where I had found this data, but that the shoplifting incidents increase with staffing levels of retail operations decreasing?
I've seen some sort of anecdotal discussion of that, so I'll check into that more. But definitely, I think
that would be very worth it to have, because I think one of the things that we know is happening is that our brick and mortar retail has greatly reduced its staff, per square foot, regardless of whether it's a Macy's, a Walgreens, a Ace Hardware, you name it. So it'd be interesting to see whether there's correlations there, which I had read there were, but.
And Tom,
that makes sense. Yeah, yes, Mike.
do we have this data going further back than 2013?
Yes. I just was focusing on a 10-year chunk, so it was.
No, I know, but like the historical level, is this historically high, or is it like the property and
yeah, it's if we went back to the 80s, we'd see it much higher, definitely.
That excuse me, it was higher in the 80s than compared to today.
Absolutely, yes. And I'll also say this is not adjusted for population. This is just pure reports. So, part of it too is we have more people over this graph for most of it. But this is just pure reports every month. The other thing I want to point out about the shoplifting reports is some places saw huge increases. Like if you look at the Sacramento Police Department and the Sacramento Sheriff, they saw 300% higher than 300% increase in shoplifting reports.
That's because Jim Cooper is doing it on purpose.
Well, I don't know if I can speak
Are
to
you
that.
suggesting that Jim Cooper is shoplifting?
No, I'm suggesting that he would like to be seen as very active in this space.
I'm teasing.
I think part of it is increased reporting. Like, there was some reporting in the Sacramento Bee that, the 3 targets in Sacramento themselves had a 300% increase in shoplifting reports. And there was early reporting in the Chronicle that, when one target in San Francisco, and it was literally Target stores. I don't mean to give anybody a free ad, or I guess this would be an anti-ad in a way. When they changed how they reported, shoplifting reports went up. So I think this is a measure that's very sensitive to that. And obviously, I know there's lots of discussion about underreporting of shoplifting and things like that. But I think that might be playing an issue here, because what we see in some individual places just doesn't seem really possible, or seems very unlikely. Okay, so that's shoplifting. The other thing I want to look at is the car part thefts. So we can look at things that are car accessories or attached to a car. And I think, catalytic converters is a big thing here. So we see this rate started to go up during the pandemic, peaked last year and then came down. I think it came down about 20% last year. And again, if we look at monthly reports, which is sort of the opposite of the shoplifting trend, that, we see it start to go up during the pandemic, and then it peaked at the end of 2022, and then it came down every month in 2023. So I think that's a good sign on that front. And this is to your question a little bit, Mike, overall theft reports. So this is every type of theft that's reported. There's about 9 different types, including very archaic things like theft from point operated machines. If anyone's interested, I can pull those numbers for you. But this as overall theft, this shows you how much is shoplifting, how much is theft of car parts. That little aqua blue line, that's shoplifting. It's typically about 13% of all reported thefts. And the yellow line is the theft of car parts. So it's a smaller percentage. But just to give you a sense of overall types of theft that we are able to see data on. Okay, but even as this is happening, I just want to talk a little bit about the number of arrests and how many people we have jail and prison. This will go very quick. So this is the total number of arrests. This is juvenile arrests, adult arrests, felony, misdemeanors, everything for the last 20 years. We can see the number of arrests, peaked in 2007, has been going down ever since. A big decrease in the pandemic, not surprising. What is surprising, though, is that we have not recovered. We have fewer arrests now than we ever have in the last 20 years. So I think in many places, you'd see a decrease in the pandemic, things would return to normal. That did not happen in California. We're arresting less people than ever, and we still have some of these record low crime rates that we talked about.
And just also go back. This is not on a per 1,000 basis. This is
total arrests, right?
So this would be even more dramatic, because over time, California's only gotten more people. Is that correct?
That's right, except for recent history. That's right. The rate would be the same trend, but it would look a little more dramatic. Exactly. And of course, what are we arresting people for? This is every arrest in 2023. The vast majority are adults arrested for misdemeanors, and then the second and a distant second is nonviolent felonies, then violent felonies, then juvenile arrests. So almost every single one of our arrests is for a misdemeanor offense, not even a nonviolent felony, a misdemeanor. This is our jail population from 2003 to 2023. We've looked at this graph a couple of times. Just to refresh, though, realignment saw, as you would expect, an increase in the jail population. Prop 47, to your point, Assembly Member Bryan, saw a big decrease right after. COVID, however, had the biggest decrease in our jail populations. And just like arrest, it went up, but it hasn't recovered to pre-COVID levels. So we have about 60,000-ish people in our jails right now. Our overall state capacity is 80,000 people. So sometimes you hear that our jails are bursting at the seams. That is not supported by the data on a statewide level. Of course, there are some individual facilities and jail systems that are more crowded, including Los Angeles County, of course. Lots that are way less crowded than that. Statewide, we're at about 70% of our rated capacity. And even the rated capacity is a very conservative estimate. Sorry, Professor Rummel.
Yeah, do you have the percentage of people serving short sentences and those awaiting trial? Is there a breakout of that? Or does it stay the same over the course of these different levels, Prop 57 and COVID and that sort of thing?
That data exists. I haven't pulled it together, but you know, I think it's something like 70 or 80% of the people in jail are there pretrial for a felony. And then almost all the rest are doing a felony sentence.
And that was true, what, since Prop 47, that's remained pretty constant?
I would suspect so, but I'd want to check before saying for sure. And then our prison population, you know, similar story. This is from 1973 to 2023. That red line is when we had the peak population. I'm sorry, Judge Espinoza.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I couldn't find my raise hand function while we were on the last subject. But
You know, you could just do this, Peter. It's like,
well, you know, I'm trying to be a little more sophisticated. So can you tell me if you know what the breakdown in the populations are for people who are in the county jail serving sentences, realignment sentences, as opposed to people who are just in the jail? What percentage of the population are AB 109? And I have a specific reason for that. I don't want to bring my pet projects to this committee necessarily, but we're dealing with an issue in the Los Angeles County Jail of 40% of the population in the jail are suffering from a serious mental illness. And we're looking for ways to remove that population from the jail into community-based care. And one of the population segments I want to look at in that effort is the AB 109 population in terms of a conversation on resentencing. So
I want to piggyback on that as well, and as perhaps a future. My team did a study, it could be as long as 10 years ago, but maybe 5 years ago, that showed that as the prison population was going down, the number of people receiving mental health treatment actually was going up, not just as a percentage of the people incarcerated, but the overall raw number of people incarcerated. And it raised some questions about were we just doing a better job identifying people who are mentally ill because our prisons and jails were so overcrowded, or were we arresting and convicting more mentally ill people, or what the hell was going on? But it was an alarming
let me just say, in LA County, the county jail population dropped significantly during the COVID crisis. And what was then 30% of the population with serious mental illness has now risen to 40%. And I'd like to suggest a third possible reason for that is there are fewer options for early release of people who are seriously mentally ill.
I concur. I think that this is something that we should look into. And and also we should figure out a good way to define what have a good definition of mental illness. There's a federal DOJ report that shows it defines mental illness differently. Anyway, like I think this is
county jail. We define that population as anyone who's in mental health housing, which means they're on psychotropic medication.
All right. Well,
so
let's table this for a further deeper dive at some point.
Yeah. So back to my original question: do we know what percentage of the county jail population statewide is serving a AB 109 sentence?
Yes, let me pull that up. I have that slide ready to go from somewhere else. It was here, let me pull a fast one and share a different screen real quick.
I didn't mean to derail the meeting.
Oh, this is it. So this was the fourth quarter of 2023, but these numbers have not changed that much recently. So it's 70% are there pretrial. The orange is pretrial and the blue are sentence. So it's about 18% are serving are sentenced for a felony.
I know, but do we know within that 18% what percentage is AB 109 and what
100%.
are no? There are people there who are serving sentences that are not based on a realignment crime, I think, or maybe I'm wrong.
If they're felonies.
Okay. All right.
It should mostly be AB 109. I think there may be a few people who are sentenced and waiting to go to prison. It's going to be a small proportion, and maybe people who have a probation condition of a jail sentence. But
that's the distinction I'm thinking of. Okay.
Yeah, this is they only reported this level of detail, unfortunately.
So some percent of the 70% of the orange line would be AB 109, as well as a large percent of the 18%. blue line.
Yeah, the pretrial.
Yeah, so the pretrial, there would be a good number of AB 109, and then that blue line that was 18% would be, I think, largely AB 109. Not all, but
The population we're looking at in LA for purposes of community-based care are people who are serving more than a year in the county jail as a result of AB 109.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry. Thanks, Tom.
No, I wish we could answer that with specificity. It really seems like we should be able to. And I know the LA sheriff has that data. I've seen it in the past, but not recently. Okay, so it's one to conclude on the prison population. So this is again.
I'm just going to pause.
Yeah.
Sorry to add on to that is that, listen, I really do appreciate that there should be focus on jails, and I appreciate Judge Espinoza, but the number of people who are serving less than 1 year in CDCR who are receiving mental health treatment is 20% of the people. It's 10,000 people. It's a huge number.
I don't know if we know how many are receiving mental health treatment, but we know that half of the people released in 2023 had been there for less than a year.
Right. So half the people, that's 15,000. And I think that there's about 30 to 40% of people are in triple CMS. I mean, whatever. It's a big number.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. Okay, last thought. So this is our prison population. This red line is when we had our peak population around 170,000 people in 2006. And then, you see the effective realignment here and a little bit of Prop 47, this drop here in 2011. And then this is the pandemic, big drops in 2020. And again, our prison population has not come back like it has in many other states. And in fact, it's continuing to go down every month a little bit. So we're at about 92,000 people right now. So not quite half of where we were at our peak, but we're trending in that direction. And again, this is while, we saw some of those record low in the crime rates that we talked about.
Can I ask another question about that?
Yeah.
Is something that we're looking at, but I was wondering if we don't have that broken down by county. I mean, LA County has also had a new district attorney in that exact same time period, and is that influencing the number?
It probably, but again, can't say for sure.
I didn't understand the question.
Well, there's less people going to prison at the same time.
Could the significant drop, given the size of LA County and the change in leadership in the district attorney's office at the exact time of the pandemic, also have contributed to the reduction in the prison population?
Well, we contribute a third of the prison population, so I would
think that, right.
Yeah.
I think that we also see similar sustained drops in the jail population. Suggests it's not limited just to one county.
Got it.
Okay, so that's 2023. That's the past. Let's talk about the more recent past. So the first quarter of 2024, the FBI has started releasing quarterly estimates based on voluntary reporting from police departments. So in California, about 48 cities have participated in this. There's about 10 million people. And the rest of the country is about 180 cities with about 59 million people. Not included in the California data, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, but some of our other very big cities are. So caveat, all that said, what do we see happening in the first 3 months in California and the rest of the country? Violent crime decreased by about 1.3%. Within that, murder went down about 24%, reports of rape 18%, robbery increased about 1%, and aggravated assault about flat. Rest of the country, overall violent crime is down 13%. You can see the other changes here. So I would say that's relatively promising. Rest of the country has bigger drops. But again, these year-to-date comparisons this early in the year, we shouldn't read too much into it for reasons I'm happy to explain later. But these are the numbers you see reported in the media a little bit, so I thought it was fair to take a California-specific look at them. That's violent crime. This is property crime. 9% drop in California, 12% drop everywhere else. And within property crime, 16% drop in burglary, 11% drop in larceny theft, which includes shoplifting, but is just a subset of it, and then car theft up 2%, and we see these other drops in the rest of the country. So that's a little peek of what we know so far this year, and then what happened last year as well. So there's a lot more in the crime data. I'm happy to dive into more things, or if anyone wants to know city specific or county specific, I'm happy to do all that analysis. Just let me know, and I'd love to share. If there's anyone else we should try to share this info with, I'm very eager to do it.
I think that we should table maybe for a future conversation about how we can be, we have, in so many ways, we, and by we, I mean Tom actually, has been kind of been in the a de facto crime data provider, repository, dashboard for other government agencies that have, not everybody here is privy to these emails and communications, but are calling Tom with somewhat urgency. You know, like, what is the car theft drop? And Tom has been doing an extraordinary job about responding to these queries. And it is shocking that California doesn't have an official crime data repository. It's something that I had tried to develop very early on in this committee. And I wonder if we should sort of formalize a way that we can and should have all this responsibility and a better way of reporting it out to not just government agencies that call me or Tom randomly, but the public. Because DOJ, which is the ostensible party responsible, just published like last week data from 2023, and it's comprehensive, but it's not as helpful as it could be.
It wasn't even that comprehensive, unfortunately. It's hard to when
I was trying to be
when
nice.
some of those I know, but when some of those big cities don't report and the change is 0.5%, we can't actually.
I appreciate that, but without adding a formal, I'm just saying that you've already taken this on as an informal responsibility for the government. I mean, this committee should know how much work you've been doing for, very senior committee, government officials. And it's extra work, and and it's great. But everybody should know it, and everybody should have access to it, better access to it. And I think that we should consider a way to make it part of our responsibility, as long as we're doing it anyway. Maybe we shouldn't be the people who are doing it, but we are, and nobody else is.
Yeah.
So that's my sort of backhanded way, I guess, of complimenting you. And
I appreciate it, of course.
Responsibility.
All right, should we move on? Should we do
Yes.
DUI or new stuff first? Do you have anyone have a strong preference? DUI.
You mean new stuff? You
probably?
mean today?
Yes. Yeah.
Let's do DUI, and then we'll get to today.
Okay. Well, lucky for you, you get to hear from Rick now. So here
Very
we go.
briefly, we'll be quick with this update, and we'll jump right into it with some research that we're going to do about the proposal that we discussed about lowering the BAC that is currently our presumptive DUI BAC is 0.08. We talked at the last meeting about lowering to that limit to 0.05. We heard about the potential benefits that could have on road safety, but also the negative impacts on equity and racial disparities. The committee was very concerned about that. We've been in conversation with Steve Raphael and the California Policy Lab, and the next step for that is going to be a presentation of research at our next meeting in September to inform that discussion before the committee considers any further recommendation on that issue. So again, we'll hear back from Steve in September, but for now we can kind of table that and move on to some other potential recommendations from that meeting. Starting with the first one, which is to create a presumptive judicial diversion for first-time DUIs. We heard about a similar type program in Pennsylvania. And the idea here is to direct judges to grant diversion for first-time misdemeanor DUI offenses as early as possible in the process, unless some fairly specific exclusions apply, which would be, there was a minor in the vehicle or there was injury. The recommendation would be to specify that even if you successfully complete this DUI diversion, if you were to get a DUI in the future, that this successful completion of diversion would count as a prior on your record, so that you could be treated as a person who has multiple DUIs and is a more serious DUI offender.
Am I correct? Am I correct in the data showing that the states that have done something similar to this have shown that this actually has a positive public safety outcome?
Correct. Yeah, the research that we heard at the last meeting indicated that folks who received DUI diversion actually recidivated less. So this DUI diversion, it does suggest that DUI diversion would have a positive public safety outcome. Concerns about DUI diversion are that it wouldn't count as a prior. So we're addressing that by saying, look, count it as a prior, but just don't subject somebody to the entire criminal process for a first-time DUI, because most of those folks aren't going to recidivate anyway. So again, specify that successful completion of DUI diversion counts as a prior. The other thing is to require that people who get DUI diversion are given a Watson advisement. Watson is a case that requires, well, I won't get into the case, but a Watson advisement basically tells people who are either arrested or convicted of a DUI that if you are drunk driving in the future and somebody is killed, you can be charged with a murder. And so it puts people on notice of the legal consequences of the dangerousness of their conduct in driving drunk. And so we would specify that people granted diversion are given the Watson advisement by the court. And then the third aspect of this recommendation is to keep ignition interlock devices as discretionary as they currently are. Right now, even for a first-time DUI, courts can order individuals to install ignition interlock device, but they are not required for a first-time DUI. And the recommendation here is just to leave that system in place, let the courts decide whether or not the individual facts and circumstances of the case warrant an ignition interlock device.
Judge Espinoza, yeah.
Yeah, do we have a sense of in what percentage of first-time DUI cases judges are actually ordering the interlock device? Because unless there's some cost sharing, I think it's pretty expensive.
It can be pretty expensive. I don't know that we have a sense of that. We can certainly follow up with the DMV data to check and see. That sounds like something that should be available, so we could definitely follow up with that.
Should also be noted that a colleague of ours introduced legislation, I don't know, last year, 2 years ago, to do DUI diversion, misdemeanor diversion, but required the interlock devices in exchange for that diversion. And the interlock companies played pretty heavy in Sacramento that year. So just giving you a full landscape of all the different interests involved in this, not just good public safety, but I like the idea of leaving the current system in place for that.
And the next proposal may address some of the financial concerns here, because we heard about these DUI programs that people who are convicted of any DUI are required to do, but that they can be cost prohibitive, and that the excessive cost can leave people kind of in legal limbo when they are unable to complete these required classes because they can't afford them. So this proposal here is to require
and can't afford the ignition lock devices too.
Correct. What we saw though is that there are more specific laws on the books about ignition interlock devices, particularly that for the DUI classes, the organizations that provide those services, they have the option of either offering a reduced fee or offering an extended payment window. And what we learned at our last meeting was that every program in the state currently offers only the extended payment window, and there's not a single program in the state that offers a reduced fee. So they're all choosing just to extend payments and, essentially leave people in debt for longer. So the requirement here, or the proposal here, would be to require those programs to actually offer a reduced fee and not just an extended payment window. We also, learned that there's not really a lot of research on the effectiveness of these DUI programs. Again, these DUI programs are not kind of your alcohol treatment programs. They are education programs about DUIs. And so the effectiveness of those programs, even for people who complete them, is kind of unknown. And so the second aspect of this recommendation will be to direct the state to continue the research on the effectiveness of this program to see whether something that the state wants to continue to require. There's no questions on that one. We'll move to the next one, which next staff proposal would be to expand the use of DUI collaborative courts. We learned a lot about the effectiveness of those courts, but that they essentially only apply to a small group of individuals, because there's only, I think, around 20 counties in the states that are using DUI collaborative courts. DUI collaborative courts are very popular in other aspects, including, drug collaborative courts and the like. And so in order to expand DUI collaborative courts and encourage counties to utilize them, we heard from some of the judges that joined the discussion last month, back in March, that establishing a statutory framework for these courts may encourage counties to develop them and utilize them. And so the recommendation here would be to put it into the penal code or related vehicle code to say, here's the statutory framework for DUI collaborative courts, not requiring counties to do it, but to build it out so that there's something that they could point to in the penal or vehicle code, which encourages them to use it. And then also to encourage them to use it just to offer some amount of funding for counties to do it. Last proposal here is to streamline license suspensions. We heard at the March meeting that a person can have their license suspended pretty quickly after they're arrested for a DUI through the administrative system that's overseen by DMV, that they can, their criminal case can take much longer to play out. And so they can serve, this license suspension essentially 2 times, once when from the administrative system, and then a second time when they're convicted in court, which may be, over a year after the initial arrest. So, it seems common sense here to specify that a person's license should only be suspended once and not multiple times. So still leave the admin per se suspension in place, but if it does take a long time for that criminal case to resolve, not to go back and issue a second suspension for the same event. So that's all we have for the DUI. We're happy to answer any questions, or if there's any other areas of research that you'd like staff to look into, just let us know.
I wasn't here for that meeting, so this may have been something you already considered and went over, but did you look at the costs of the administrative proceeding at DMV? It's my understanding, and this is historical, that it's extremely costly to take whatever appropriate action you need to take at the DMV in their administrative process to retain your license or have it reinstated at the appropriate time. Did that come up at all in the hearing, or is that something you could take a look at in terms of talking about costs of, being prohibitive of the ignition device and other types of things where some people are just kind of closed out from the ability to have their license reinstated at the appropriate time?
We did not discuss the cost of, fighting at the case at the administrative hearing. That's the administrative hearing. People, they don't have they don't get a court-appointed attorney, unlike in criminal case. You do have the right to have an attorney, represent you during that, but that would be on your own dime. So we didn't really discuss the cost of that, and we don't really have any information about how many people are utilizing the administrative process to fight their case at that stage. So I don't know if there's anything else on that, Tom.
No, it wasn't something that came up in our research at all, but I think we can try to take a look at it and see if it's been addressed somehow. There are definitely concerns about not being able to pay some of the debt associated with completing your requirements after conviction that prevented you from getting your license back. And that's one of the things we're hoping to address too. But it's a great thing to think about.
My recollection helping someone with pro bono with a DUI several years ago and talking closely with the DUI attorney who handles a lot of them is there's some process, people with money can get through some quick process to get their license back. And if you don't have a lot of money, you really get stuck and it can take a very long time to get your license back. And if that's still true, I think it would be worth looking at.
I know that we're happy to look at that. I know that there was a recent law change that allowed people to get their license back very quickly after a DUI arrest if you install an ignition interlock device on your car. But as
There were two parts. I think there were two parts of those requirements, and they were both costly. I think that's what I'm talking about, Rick. I think you're on the right track.
But with the ignition interlock device, unlike the DUI programs that allow, just this extended payment option and don't require, a reduced fee, for the ignition interlock devices, there is actually statutorily required reduced fee for low income people. So there's not, not to say that there aren't, equity issues there with being able to afford the ignition interlock devices, but they're just not, I guess, as acute as in the DUI program space where they're not required to offer a reduced fee.
All right.
Listen, I'm glad that we are digging into this DUI issue. I think that there's a lot of interesting and important details and folds, and I think that we can and should make some pretty strong and meaningful recommendations here. It also affects huge, something, Heidi, that you also missed. I forget what the number was, but a huge number of arrests and prosecutions are DUI cases. So it's like, it's a major part of California's criminal justice system. It also, obviously, there's, tons of injuries and deaths and property damages as a result. So I think this is an area that we can make, and it's super confusing. So I think it's right for our involvement. As we near recommendation time, I guess I might lean on you, Senator Skinner, a bit, that there was, if you added it up, maybe that we had 10 different sort of sub proposals all under the DUI umbrella. I don't know if that's strategically a good idea or not for this committee, but maybe if you could give that some thought between now and Thanksgiving.
And and I think the diversion piece is extremely important, but obviously lowering the BAC is sort of the key thing, and we're putting that off a little bit to really look at the research. And our hope is we'll have Steve come in September, and then maybe you can come back in October where we have another meeting scheduled if you all have questions of the September meeting, so we can really engage with that as deeply as possible. Because I think as we all spoke about last time, if California took that step, it would be really significant. So we want to just be even more careful than we are about everything else with it.
I think it's worth looking at there's been a lot of, as Assemblymember Brian mentioned, and even before he was in the legislature, a lot of legislation around DUIs, and I think it'd be good to look at, what succeeded, what didn't, and maybe trying to get a sense of why. I mean, in my experience on the Public Safety Committee, we mostly would modify or kill those things that added a lot more cost to the low-income person in terms of getting the DUI. Not minimizing who could get it, but rather under what circumstance you got it, but rather trying to minimize that cost.
Well, in any event, I agree. I think we're all sort of on the same page that this is a large area, and I think it'll be a big focus of our recommendation this year. I think it's important. I think it also fits within our wheelhouse of areas that we can make a genuine improvement in public safety, clarity of the various laws, improve racial equity, and reduce the number of people and the impact of the legal system. So I'm excited for it. I know that there's a lot of work ahead, but I think that I think this is a ripe area for us.